We'll have this panel on the impact of technological change on jobs, and the purpose of this panel start two sides, this phenomenon of impact of internet on employment. And we have 4 excellent speakers: Vincenzo Spiezia from the OECD, Paolo Naticchioni from Roma Tre University in Rome, Jonathan Liebenau from London School of Economics, and David Viviano from SAG-AFTRA Labor Union. So I will give the floor to Vincenzo Spiezia.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. I look forward to an interesting day. It's always a bit complicated to address this issue, especially at the beginning of a day, because what is the relationship between ICTs and employment? There are so many different angles you can approach the issue. So let me try to start with something relatively simple and also a bit standard academic, if you like, standard economics, and then let's see whether we can develop further in a more policy-oriented or more practical discussion. So basically what I'm going to do is to give a little overview of what is the economic theory about the impact, the expected impact of innovation in general on employment. Then some evidence from recent studies. I'm going to show an analysis that on which we have been working for some time at the OECD at the macroeconomic level, so on the impact of ICT on the total employment, on the level of total employment, provide some estimates, and then introduce a discussion of what does it mean and what are the implications of all that. Again, you excuse me for something so simple. I mean, I think the simple way to start the discussion is to look at the labor demand as simply the results of two components. One is production output, and the other is the labor that you need to produce unit on output, which is the flip side of average productivity. So basically, you can start to look what are the effects on employment, looking at these two aspects. And you have a first look is basically in terms of technology, which says that there are a number of process innovation that makes the production process more efficient. If you refer to ICTs, you have automation, you have communication, so the possibility to delocalize, coordinate complex production activities across countries, the big data more recently, and so on. So all of that tend to reduce the number of people that you need to produce a given level of output. But on the other side, there are, so the effect is negative. You have also a number of innovation that are normally called product innovation, which tend to create new products, new markets, new demand. So the impact is normally expected to be positive. So, and the ICT, interesting, and many other general purpose technologies tend to have both aspects. On the one side, they reduce the labor that is needed. On the other side, create opportunities for labor in different markets and different activities. The overall impact, if you like, if you stay only at technology, if you look at technology, is unclear. I mean, there is no reason why the two should compensate. There is no reason to expect that the effect is going to be positive or negative on employment. Now, in the economic theory, this issue of the innovation and the possibility of technological unemployment has been a long-standing issue. It goes back to Say, to Ricardo, to Marx, and go on, Keynes. So it's and the literature has basically identified 4 channels through which the economy reacts to the initial shock of technology. And I think this is an important point, because any discussion we can have about ICTs and employments, it doesn't have to be about technology, it has to be about economics. It's how the economy reacts to a shock which is exogenous. So what is the channels through which the economy adjusts and probably generate further employment or further growth. So these channels in the compensation theory are basically via new machineries, by lower prices, by higher profits, by lower wages, and by new products, which is the product innovation I mentioned. Just to give, again, a very naive representation of these 4 channels, on the one hand, you have the technology that tend to destroy jobs for a given level of output. Also, as I mentioned, increase, in order to introduce new machineries, you increase the demand for the production, for the supply of these capital goods. So there is an effect which is negative on the final sector, if you like, and one which is positive on the intermediate sector and production. At the same time, lower labor unit per output means lower costs. And if it's lower costs are translated to prices, means lower price and therefore higher demand for the products that are already produced. If we are in a system which is not perfectly competitive, some of these decreasing costs will end up in higher profits, so the effect on price and demand will be lower, but these higher profits are higher income, which is also going to be spent, and again to generate higher demands. And then finally, there's also the issue, the possibility that whatever mismatch in the labor market, there is a change in wages that can adjust for the potential negative effect on employment. So overall, the debate, the prediction of the compensation theory that there would be, if you start in a situation of full employment after a technological shock, you will end up to full employment because the market will take care of through these different channels. Of course, there are a number of things that need to be put in place, whether the adjustment through new machineries will work or not, whether capital inputs will generate enough demand to compensate for the reduction in labor demand in the final sectors, depend on the nature of technology, the labor-saving bias. The more technology reduce labor demand compared to other inputs, the stronger it's the need for production of capital inputs. There is an issue of the final markets, the degree of competition, the access to capital markets. If you need to start new production in order to generate this additional demand, the underlying hypothesis is that new firms can access the capital markets and to get the resources they need. If it's not the case, the compensation will not happen. There is an issue of consumer preferences as well. I mean, in certain industries, traditional industries where productivity is going up dramatically and prices down, there is a limit to which you can sell shoes or clothes. Or I mean, there is a matter of preferences as well. So there is, if you like, in more technical terms, the elasticity of demand to prices tend to decrease or to be lower in certain sectors than others. So there is also an issue of not only how prices are going to affect demand, but also in which industries these lower prices are going to have an effect. And also in terms of firms' expectations. I think it's a big issue, it's a major factors. Also you expect, as is the case often, huge prospect for business, for growth and so on from new technologies. There is an issue that firms tend to hold on until they understand where these new opportunities will come up, in which technology, in which new line of business they have to start. So there is a kind of delay in this process. And then as regards to wages, okay, there are institutional mechanisms that limits or regulate wage bargaining, but it's also a more fundamental, more economic issues of the possibility, the degree of input substitutions. Once you are moved from the production line with workers to an automated production line, you can put down wages as much as you can. No firm is going to go back to hire the same previous production process because it's more efficient, because the new one are more effective and so on. So also the room for wage substitutions through change in relative prices is also limited by the production function, if you like, by whether it's a fixed or whether it's flexible. So, I mean, from the theory to the actual economy, if you like, there are a number of things that need to be in place for the compensation theory, for the compensation mechanism to work. And if you like, these points that I put on the table are also areas where there is possible action for policy in terms of increasing or making more effective these different channels, different things that need to be in place for technology to create employment at the same time. So the main points again, the final outcomes depends on opposite forces. We've seen there are opposite across industries, across firms, across countries. So every time, there are many studies, but every time one looks at one bit of this story, it ends up with a partial and biased assessment of the overall impact, because whether compensation is going to take, compensation might take place in different places, in different industries, other firms. I mentioned again that the conditions for this mechanism are not always met in practice. There is also an implications on income distribution between capital, labor, and so on. It is a possibility, not through this mechanism, that eventually, even if you keep full employment, the wages that are paid to workers are lower, so the share might shrink. So that's something that it's an outcome. I mean, in order to guarantee full employment, there might results. Again, it's driven by technology. And then again, it requires mobility of resources. It requires for compensation to take place, it requires workers to move from one activity to another, but also management, skills, firms, capitals, and so on. Very shortly, all of this takes time. It's not a linear process, it takes time and so on. So from the technological shock to the potential positive or null impact, there might be short-term effects that can be pretty important. If you look at some of the previous studies, I mean, one first, there are three, you can look at this at three levels. One is the macro level, the total economy level. One is the sector level, and the third one is at the micro level, the firm level. The first thing that is striking is that there is basically no recent study that looks at the overall impact of ICT on employment. All the studies look at specific sectors, specific firms, and so on. If you want to go back, if you want to have a study that looks at total employment, so the overall level, the impact of the overall level of employment, you need to go back to Lyer and Nickel. I think it's second half of the 80s, early 90s, the latest thing. So it's already pretty surprising that there is a lot about the composition of employment, the change in skills that are demanded, but there is nothing about will all this create more jobs, less jobs? What is going to be the overall impact? So there is a lack of studies on that. Sectoral studies, there are numbers. I'm more familiar with those that comes from the EU. I haven't seen many from North America or other countries. Basically, in terms of, a lot of them focus on manufacturing for obvious reasons. And the drivers for the decrease in employment in manufacturing are basically weak final demand. We're back to one of the issues I mentioned before. Okay, there is an increase in wages has been the prevalence of labor-saving process innovations and very little product innovation. So that's typical profile of mature industries where firms gain market share by reducing costs rather than innovating and launching new products. Again, if you look at job losses, that's kind of mirror images. They occur mostly in large firms among low-skilled workers. But here again, there is an issue of whether this is the result of a bias of technology or just a queuing effect. I mean, if you need to cut jobs, you will start from the less qualified rather than top qualified. So there is it happened in ICT and capital-intensive industries, most of job losses, and in financial sector. So that's the kind of pattern we see in terms of industries. And job concentration job creation was concentrated in industries with high demand growth, again with the prevalence of product innovations, and in the open economy specialized in innovative and fast-growing activities. So again, in activities that where there are market opportunities in the world market. You also have, I think Ellie mentioned before, a number of studies that look at the employment multipliers. Some of the authors of these studies are sitting in this room. They tend to look, okay, how many jobs are generated for one job created in the ICT sectors. The estimates are pretty high. They range quite a lot. There are some studies that look at broadband. Basically, from one job created in the broadband sectors, you have in between 1.9 and 3.6 jobs created in other industries. There are similar studies on mobile application, on Facebook, on high tech. I mean, my take of these studies that are very interesting, they definitely unveil issues that are important in terms of what are new technology where job opportunities may create. But again, they miss the overall pictures of what is going to happen in other parts of the economy, what is the overall balance on employment creation or distractions. I think, okay. Two things that we might take after this short literature review. The first of all is that the way you measure ICT is important. I just want to quote a study by Severnini. It's somehow old, but basically what it does, it replicates the same analysis on the impact of ICT on employment using different measure of ICTs. And it gets completely different results depending on the proxy that is used for ICTs. When you use just a time trend for ICT productivity growth, it gets negative effects in the short run, positive in the long run, but they're not significant. If you use another common measure of ICT investment to output, it depends on the countries, it depends on the periods, there is no clear evidence. And if you take multifactorial productivity as a measure of the impact of ICT, you get negative effects. So again, in all studies that we see, I think there is an important issue of what we're trying to measure. I mean, what kind of theory you have in mind that justify that you use certain measure for ICT rather than others. Otherwise, you end up with some correlations and you don't know exactly what they tell you. I'm sorry, that's a kind of basic observation, but it tends to be, it tends to be repeated that there is this content literature. The second one is the level of analysis matters. I mentioned that before. It's very trendy to do firm level analysis. I do some of them myself. You get a number of insights on within firms, on what are the mechanisms that applies, of course, within firms, but you don't get anything about what happens in other firms. When you find out that firms that innovate, use ICT more, create more jobs, you don't know whether it's the net creation of job or just taking out market share from other competitors and so destroying job. So it's good to find out that innovation is positive for firms, it's good to find out effects, but again, it doesn't tell you anything about what is the overall employment impact. The issue with industry analysis is similar. There is compensation. Job destruction in one industry may lead to job creation in others, the other way around. And then macro estimates, for which there is very little. It's true that in terms of the analysis, when you work with aggregate data, you have compounding effects, so it's very difficult then to, I mean, it's less robust in terms of economics and so on to micro level analysis. Having said that, what I'm going to show is basically a macroeconomic approach. I'm aware of the costs in terms of the identification, the technique of the analysis. But on the other hand, the issue, again, I want to address is what is the overall impact of employment. I'm taking a simple approach. Basically, the idea is that fast progress, technological progress in ICT has led to a rapid decrease in ICT, in the cost of ICT equipment and software. And this, therefore, has induced large investment in ICT. So it's really the traditional channels from technology, price, and usage that I'm going to look at. I'm trying to formalize the two effects I mentioned before. One is in terms of substitutions. If ICT becomes cheaper, I use more ICT and less labor for you to output. And then the second one, if ICT becomes cheaper, costs are lower, prices are lower, so I may generate more demand. So there is a scale effect on output. The first effect is basically measured by the elasticity of substitutions, and the second one by the elasticity to price of income, the elasticity of demand to price and the income. As I'm working on total economy, I expect this elasticity to be equal to 1. The data confirm that this is the case, so the estimated elasticity of income and price are not different from 1. So the key parameters for us is the elasticity of substitutions. And the standard theory, if you like, is that the impact of ICT's investment on labor will be positive if the elasticity of substitution is lower than 1. Basically, if substitution is less strong than the impact of on output. That's the basic thing. So the work is to estimate these elasticities. I've just taken a standard textbook approach, look at the labor demand function. You might see that it's basically it's the labor share in total cost. It's hours times wages divided total cost. It's a function of the input cost of the other production, the cost of the other production input, 5 minutes. And the one novel aspect of the whole analysis is the measure I've used for ICT, user cost. It's often the case that this is taken as a residual from the labor cost share. In this case, the OECD has built up a measure which is basically of ICT user cost, which depends in embodied the expectation from firms. So it's It's based on the idea that when new capital goods are made available, firms invest according to the efficiency of these capital goods. So it's a way to retrieve the implicit user cost which cannot be observed. Of course, you need to have strong hypothesis about the fact that expectations of firms are well behaved and can go far ahead. I can discuss that later if you like. In terms of the driving variables, these are the change in the ICT user cost of capital between 2012. I've broken down the time, the period in three bits. One is before the dot-com bubble, so before 2001. The second one is between 2001, 2007, 2008, depending on countries. And the third one is after the crisis. You can see that in the three periods, the ICT user costs have gone down. You can see that the largest decrease has occurred in between 2001 and 2007, so before the crisis, somehow lower after the crisis. And you can also see that there are huge differences among countries. So the cost for an ICT equipment in Denmark has decreased much faster than in many other countries, the same in Germany and so on. So that's an important component of the things that we're going to see. I skipped the regression. I just put on the paper to show that, I mean, it's a system regression. You have the three shares of the three production inputs. I've taken just two for the obvious reason. Done all the normal tests and so on, endogeneity, and again, we can discuss that if you're interested in details. The kind of results of the regression is the curve that you see here. This is the change in employment due to an increase or to a decrease in ICT user cost, a 5% decrease, just for convention. You see that the curve is not linear. You have basically an effect in the short run, which tend to be after a peak, tend to become negative, and then in the long run, these effects disappear. You go back to the initial level of employment. The idea is basically that the initial effect is that you reduce an ICT cost. So the costs are lower, prices are lower. I'm getting there. And there is a positive output effect. Firms cannot adjust production input the mix immediately. After some time, they are able to change, so to substitute workers with ICTs. That's why you get the substitution effects and this negative effect of employment. And then after the adjustments taking place, you get the output effect gets progressively kicking again, and you end up to this effect. So basically, the idea is that in the long run there is no effect of ICT on employment, but in the short run these effects can be negative. And the other consideration is that the chart I show you is just one-off decrease in ICT, a permanent one, but we have seen a decrease in ICT user cost over 25 years. So the overall impact has been accumulating over time. This is why you ended up with something like that. This is based on the regression that accounts the change in employment due to ICT user cost in the three periods I mentioned. And you can see that while in many countries there was a positive effect until 2001, in some also in between the two crises, then it becomes negative in most countries after 2007, and also in between the two tends to be negative. So that's just the magnification. I'm just taking the last period after the crisis. You can see that they're pretty large in number of countries. So I understand I finished my time. We're still working on other two things, which is the industry's composition and the education composition. I hope to have the opportunity to give you these results later on. I don't want to, again, just as a final words, I think that the nice things of this type of approach is that it takes back to economic theory. It's a way to look at the different aspects of economics. You have something that is consistent to economic theory if you believe the underlying assumptions, which are pretty strong, but you also show that these short-run effects are strong enough and long enough to justify a policy intervention of some type for a number of people, workers. So I suppose that we'll be discussing these issues later on. So I will stop here. Sorry for having.
Okay, thank you very much, Vincenzo. And so, unless there is a very compelling question at the moment, I will prefer to give the floor to all the panel, and then we'll have 5-7 minutes of discussion. Okay? So now the word to Paolo Naticchioni from Roma 3 University.
Okay, thank you very much to the organizer for giving me the opportunity to present here this ongoing research with Giuseppe Ragusa from Unis University and Claudia Vittori from Sapienza University. So, our research is focused on Europe and on job polarization. And the main contribution is using longitudinal data, so we are able to follow individual over time to see what's going on, whether you are a routine job or an abstract job and so on. This is our approach. And just to motivate the paper, as you know, there is wide evidence on the impact of technology and ICT on job polarization for the US. There is lower or little evidence for Europe, even if there are now recent papers analyzing this issue. So our contribution is to investigate the European case and to focus on job polarization using longitudinal data. So using longitudinal data, we can investigate the flows to unemployment and to unemployment benefits. So it's the title was a welfare approach because we want to see whether the loser, so who are the losers. It's true that routine workers are more likely to become unemployed, and it's true that there are any unemployment benefits for them and so on. And also institution matter for this kind of stuff. And then also, since we have the whole set of European countries, we can investigate the different group of countries at least. So southern country, continental, Anglo-Saxon, northern, and eastern country. Because of course, they are very different one another. And then the last thing we're gonna do is how routinization affect the job mobility patterns in the labor market. Now we will show how workers, in a sense, escape from routine jobs using job mobility. We will show you in a moment. So I don't have time to go into the details of job polarization literature, but of course, as you know, the impact of ICT and technology affect the levels, and as Vincenzo was suggesting us, but also the composition in the labor force, composition of task. And so there is now this literature on task-biased technological change. So the ICT complement abstract tasks, so these kind of jobs are problem solving and so on, while replace routine tasks. So routine workers are the ones that have most troubles in the labor market. Why? It's easy, because they can be replaced easily by technology. While the effect on the unskilled labor is ambiguous, and actually there has been evidence of an increase in jobs in the service sector, unskilled labor that cannot be easily replaced by technology. You know, you can think about the care services or transportation, restoration, and so on. And there are many papers by author and others on this kind of stuff. So far the focus has been on stocks. So scholars have compared like composition of in the labor force like in the 80s and the one in 2000 to see what's going on between the two time periods. But there are not many papers analyzing the flows, so analyzing the individual career of people. One of the first papers for the US is by Cortez. It's been published recently. And it shows that flows are crucial to understand the mechanism behind this process. And so Cortez shows that routine jobs have higher probability to separate, to end their job. And they find that high-skill routine workers have high probability to move to abstract jobs. So if they can escape from a routine job, if they are good in routine jobs, they escape towards abstract jobs. And low-ability routine workers have high probability to move to manual and service jobs. And then the Cortez shows that the decrease in routine employment observed in the US is due to the change in the propensity of young workers to enter the labor market. So young workers now, they do not enter in routine jobs, they enter directly in manual or abstract job in the US. We will see in Europe is going to be different. So the contribution is using longitudinal data for Europe. I don't spend time on the data. It's very standard European data, official data in a sense. It's a survey on income and living condition. It's a panel data, so we can follow people over time. The time span is 2004-2012. And the measure of task variable is the standard one used by author, and so it's a very standard measure in this kind of literature. Is a synthetic index called RTI, and as you know, there are databases that can classify occupation into routine jobs, abstract, and manual. So they use this kind of database and they derive this measure. So they derive measure for being routine jobs, manual intensity, abstract intensity, and routine intensity, and they derive a synthetic index. The higher this index, the higher is your routinization in your job. Okay. Okay, so before moving to the longitudinal data that are the most interesting in our analysis, I just show you that also in Europe you have a decrease in the routinization. So routine jobs are decreasing over time, because though the main intuition is there, the technology tend to replace this kind of job. So you have a decreasing trend over time, both using the RTI index and also using the routine intensity. So these are intensity of routinization. So they are not a binary variable, but in a sense continuous variable. And you can see that they decrease over time. And you can also see that between country groups, there are differences. So you have that, for instance, the Nordic country have a much lower level of routine jobs. So they seems to have an economy with a lower level of routine jobs. So maybe there this kind of change in the labor market has already taken place. While in the southern and continental Europe area, you have higher degree of routine jobs, but for all country groups, you have a decreasing trend over time. So routine jobs tend to decrease, even if levels are different. Okay, so this is just to give you an overview of what we have in the data, and then we move to the longitudinal part. I want to show you something that is different with respect to the US. We have just the determinants of RTI. So we have a regression. The dependent variable is the level of routinization in your job, the intensity of routinization. These are standard control variable. And I don't have time to discuss this variable. I want just to show you that the coefficient for age is negative. It means that in Europe, it seems that the younger have high level of routinization, while the adults, in a sense, have a lower level of routinization. And it's at odds with what we were expecting. And we will see later on also some figures that are consistent with this fact. So of course, one might expect that the young people are more complementary to technology, so they should have more likely to have abstract jobs, while we don't find this evident for Europe. So let's move to the unemployment inflow. So we want to study whether routinization is increasing the probability to become unemployed. So we can investigate career of individuals, and then we can investigate whether having high level of routinization implies higher probability to become unemployed. And to what extent? So we can use longitudinal data, so we identify the determinants of becoming unemployed next year, time t plus 1, for those who are employed now. So you can see just this is simple regression, and you can see that when considering all European countries together, the impact is positive. So it means that the higher your level of routinization in your job, the higher the probability to become unemployed. So there is an issue. Technology increase tend to, in a sense, destroy jobs. It is true that if you are a routine job that can be replaced by technology, your probability to become unemployed is higher. So the question is, to what extent? Since the baseline probability to become unemployed is 2%, our coefficient increased this probability by 0.2%. So it means 10% more. That is not negligible. Okay? If you are, for one standard deviation increase of the routinization index in intensity, you have 10% more probability to become unemployed. Okay? So, in a sense, when we were talking about losers, actually, if you are a routine workers, it is true that you're going to be more likely is going to be unemployed in the next year. And it is true for all group of countries, and especially not in the Anglo-Saxon one. This is positive, but it's not statistically significant. So it seems to be very homogeneous in all group of countries. And then just to have, we interact the crisis with the RTA index. I don't show you the table, but just to tell you that the crisis has increased the probability to become unemployed for routine workers, especially for Southern European countries. And this is why in Southern European countries, of course, because the crisis there was stronger. No? In Italy, Spain, Greece, of course, the crisis was much stronger. And so in Southern countries, the crisis has boosted the reallocation process at the firm level. They had to change. They couldn't wait longer. So they have replaced more routine jobs with other kind of jobs. So it seems that some decades ago, the unskilled workers were considered the weak component in the labor market. The skill bias, technological change, literature told us that the unskilled were the weak segment in the labor force. Now it seems to be that the routine workers that are not necessarily the unskilled, but maybe they are middle skilled, they are becoming those who are more exposed to shocks in the labor market. They could be considered as the new unskilled workers in a sense. Now I want to investigate also something that comes from a very recent OECD report that came out just some weeks ago that emphasized the role of institutions. So this OECD report on inequality, that is a different division with respect to the one of Vincenzo, stressed that institutional change favoring more flexible labor force are at work in reshaping the pattern of employment polarization. So the countries that experienced polarization were characterized by high level of employment protection legislation for regular jobs and low level for protection in temporary jobs. So they stressed the role of institutions, and they argued that the polarization is associated with temporary contracts. So they showed this graph, for instance, in which you have no routine manual tasks, so the new unskilled labor that are growing in the US and in Europe, and they show that most of the increase in this kind of jobs in most of all European countries take place using non-standard contracts. So non-standard contract is favoring, in a sense, the polarization process in Europe. And so this is an important issue because it is, in a sense, the first evidence that mix, in a sense, institution and temporary contract with polarization trends. We can confirm in our data this kind of evidence, since we can show that the routinization index is negatively correlated with temporary contracts, and that these kind of contracts are more likely to be used for manual and service jobs. So it is true that this kind of contract, temporary contract, are used for unskilled and service contracts, and so the increase in this kind of contract is related to the type of contract. And then we also show that for those who have that the probability to become unemployed is higher if you have a temporary contract. The impact of RTI on the probability to become unemployed is stronger for temporary contracts. So it means that there is a high turnover. If you have a routine job, it's more likely that you find a temporary contract, but it's also more likely that you separate, that you become unemployed because there is more churning in the labor market. And so we just confirm that institution matter, and the reduction in APL, the employment practice legislation, seems to favor the technology diffusion and adoption and the polarization in the labor market. It is not new, in a sense, because, of course, higher flexibility favor the technological adjustment. So the last so just a welfare, to focus on welfare, we also show that we investigate whether having a routine jobs increase the probability to receive unemployment benefit. And I don't show you the table, but we can show that the probability to receive unemployment benefits next year increase if you have a routine jobs today. Okay, so it's very close. The trends are similar for if you have a routine jobs, you have higher probability to lose your job, but also higher probability to receive benefits. So in a sense, the welfare system is incorporating already these changes in the labor market. Why? Because unemployment benefits in Europe are not means tested in any way. So it's not target on some specific skills or for unskilled labor or some other kind of task. So if it's more likely that routine jobs become unemployed, it's more likely that you will get unemployment benefits. So here we're talking about welfare and about passive labor market policy, in a sense, unemployment benefit. It could be possible to have some policy, in a sense, active labor market. It could be possible to talk about active routine-based policy, in a sense, something like training specific to workers to change their competencies in the labor market and so on. Of course, here it's a big debate. On the one hand, we have the European employment strategy that really focused in the last 20 years on training. In the other, we have the other scholars like Ekman and others that say that retraining workers when they are adults, they were 40, 50 years old, it's not efficient. So there is this debate. It's worth doing training for this kind of jobs to change their competencies, their tasks from routine to abstract. Is it possible? How much does it cost? There are some optimistic, there is an optimistic view, like the European Commission that's focused on a lot on training, and other scholars that are much more pessimistic. Can I have 1 minute more? Thank you very much. So, yeah. So the last thing I want to show is job mobility as a way to escape from routinization. So if routinization is associated to higher risk to become unemployed and poor expectation in individual careers, one might expect that workers use mobility to escape from routine jobs. And so we can investigate this issue considering the sample of workers that change jobs from time t to time t+1. And what we see, we regress. We see that when, without going into details, that when, on average, when workers move from one job to another, they reduce the level of routinization in their jobs. So they tend to escape from routine jobs. Job mobility is used, and the coefficients are really big in magnitude and significant. When they change job, they tend to reduce the level of routinization because they are worried about this kind of expectation in the future. Okay. I just finished stressing the young individuals. So why they are different from the US case? As I told you, the age affect negatively the RTI index. So if you are young, you have higher level of routine jobs. The issue of temporary contracts for Europe that are massively used for young workers, of course, not for adults. And then the job mobility used by workers, mainly by young individuals, to escape from routinization. So all these three facts that we found in our research concern mainly young individuals. And so this is interesting because in Europe we have this huge problem of youth unemployment rate that in some countries is close to 40%, even more, like in Italy, Greece, and Spain. So in a recent paper, we are trying to investigate this issue. What's going on in Europe for young individuals? Why it seems to be the opposite of what we were expecting? No? They should be the most complementary to technology, but at the end, it seems the opposite. Okay, thank you for the extra time,
okay.
And I hope I was clear.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Now the turn of Jonathan Liebenau for London School of Economics.
Thanks, Jeff. So what I'm going to be reporting on is Vincenzo called it the fashionable element, done in a slightly different way, but firm and sector level studies. This is one bit of the story, and I'm still not able to put these bits of the story together with the larger composition of employment matters. So I am a bit ambivalent still about where we want to take this notion that industry level and firm level studies are going to sort of aggregate. But the questions that I began with, because I'm from a department of management rather than a department of economics, had much more to do with how particular kinds of firms deal with particular kinds of technological opportunities and to address these often exaggerated claims. Broadband build-out will create 5 million UK jobs. Cloud services will generate 12 million new jobs in Europe, and these numbers come out of the air. There's a British comedy radio show which has a character who constantly goes around reporting in polite dinner conversation that 320 billion, bacteria in our guts, 320 billion feet to the sun, 320 billion years since the dinosaurs, 320 billion euros in Greek debt. 320 billion keeps on coming up as, I know this, by the way, that's about the number of Greek debt. But the others, of course, just emphasize the absurdity of making these kinds of estimates. So the background here, where's my, is 4 studies on labor market effects of ICT, very much focused. The first of these come from work that R.D. Atkinson did. Now, that was a very specific kind of study. The question was, would the Obama stimulus plan be well spent in putting money into ICT? And the answer was, well, if you target it in particular ways, it has certain kinds of effects. And I think the report was certainly very interesting in 2009 and had some effect in the way that the Obama administration addressed the question of how stimulus spending ought to go. And following on from that, on Robert Atkinson's D, we call you D and C? Yes.
Rob. He's Rob.
Rob says, we'll see if we can do this for Europe. And I said, yeah, that's great, we'll do it for Europe. But he was getting IBM funding, and they didn't want to pay for all of Europe, so we did it for the UK. But it was a very interesting and important report in that it did address the question of whether any kind of US model of stimulus spending was going to be having the same kinds of effects elsewhere. And we gleefully went into the project assuming that it would, and we could just adjust where it would go. In fact, it came out quite a bit more difficult than that when we realized that we really couldn't take the same kind of assumptions about the US economy and apply them to the UK economy, and even less so than to elsewhere in Europe. And we adjusted things, but we did come out with some parallel, interesting kinds of results. So that was the first of the studies. And then I got some Microsoft funding. Microsoft thought that I would be able to promote their position, showing that cloud services were going to solve the unemployment problem worldwide. And we adjusted the model looking just at 2 exemplary sectors. One, I'll come to some of the more details of this, but one of them indeed an old manufacturing sector, but another a rapidly growing service sector. So we got some idea of what these differences might be, made the model for that, and found that indeed cloud does have positive employment effects. The problem is they're tiny, and I'll come back to why. So we did this then on a more targeted way for the situation just in Turkey. Again, Microsoft thought that this would come up with a great kind of explanation for how adjusting this rapidly growing economy would have great employment positive effects, and we would then go on to do the rest of Middle East and Africa and show how in developing economies, or at least rapidly growing economies, cloud services are going to have nice positive outcomes. Again, the result turns out to be, yes, positive, but minuscule, tiny, and we can explain why. Now, the fourth of the studies is one that I did with Michael Mandel. You may know Michael's work on the digital economy in New York. He had done this first with Bloomberg funding a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and tried to explain, I think in very interesting ways, what the effects would be at the local level. He then went on to do it for San Francisco, so he had a nice, clear comparison of a certain set of criteria about the employment effects in New York versus San Francisco and then the Silicon Valley area. And then the question is, can we model London in the same way? And the short answer is yes, and we come up with some very interesting and indeed positive results from these things. But none of this is science. It's not even economics. My economist colleagues at the LSE generally despair of the sorts of studies, but the industry and others are fascinated by them, but somewhat fearful. Nevertheless, it has a lot of appeal to policymakers. So let me speak a bit about the generalized methodology. We're looking at new jobs and their knock-on effects. We're interested in job losses, losses through efficiency gains, as was described in the first talk especially, and losses due to obsolescence. But we're also interested in trying to track where firms or general trends within sectors will predict that jobs will be redeployed rather than necessarily let off. And there is a bit of background that I had from this, again with some industry funding. We did a survey on a variety of things. This project was called Efficient Enterprise, not my preferred name. But included in that was a large, if dirty, survey of CIOs that included a few questions intended to discern their hiring, firing, and in particular redeployment intentions under different scenarios. So this just gave us a feeling for this question of whether people are serious about retaining skilled people in jobs if they were displaced in particular kinds of ways. Typical question of whether cloud services or other kind of outsourcing activities would lead departments to be essentially just let off en masse or not. So it's very much a bottom-up study. It deals with a lot of proxies and intention to get a feeling for how the technology actually works, looking at tasks not classified in the normal ways except in Michael Mandel's study with me, but tasks that I needed to reinterpret with the help of colleagues and assistants who were engineers to really consider what these effects were going to be on particular kinds of individuals. All right, so let me talk briefly about each of these studies and then try to come to some general conclusion. So the UK investment study. So first of all, we were looking at intended investments. This was the case with Rob Atkinson's US study, also on stimulus spending. The definition of stimulus spending in this sort of situation is that the kind of priorities are already identified. The scale of spending over some vague period would be more or less known. We didn't exaggerate that. We just said what would happen if, to the employment effects, if this went much faster. And in here, we needed to distinguish short-term jobs, especially jobs which were in positions like construction or basic equipment manufacturing, from new employment that was associated with business expansion and creation, the maintenance of new facilities, what happens when you build a data center. The data centers are very interesting and important element to these stories because a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about building out the digital economy is now building out the architecture of the internet, including particular data centers. Data centers are pretty standard operations now. They cost a $500 million to build, more or less wherever you build them. How much running them is almost entirely to do with how much energy costs. They employ lots and lots of people in the construction phase. They employ a significant number of people, mostly in China, for the manufacture of equipment, and they employ 4 people inside and 2 gardeners and a security guard once they're up and running. So you do get this curve which shows short-term employment boost for these kinds of investment, and then very little sustained employment. So we wanted to look in particular at which of these kinds of investments were going to have which effects on long and short-term employment. And we made a number of hypotheses, as you can see. And then for the UK study, we looked specifically just at 3 technologies: intelligent transport systems, already consistent with policy. We're going to have intelligent transport systems in the country someday, somehow. What happens when you boost the investment in it? Similarly, smart energy technologies, by which we mean in particular things like smart metering, what happens, and then broadband build-out. And it turns out that, among other things, what's particularly important about this is what are you actually able to do domestically that boosts domestic employment, and what effect does that have on the companies that are supplying those goods and services, and what are you going to be importing? And for that, we scrutinize trade data very carefully. We didn't make too many assumptions beyond what the trade data showed us, except to say that when the government sends out procurement specifications for things like intelligent transport systems, domestic producers may have certain kinds of advantages through standard setting and other kinds of specifications, also early warning, that might give them a slight advantage. So we did these studies and came up with the assumption that if we're going to put in £5 billion for each of these sectors in the short term, you get big numbers of total jobs, and there's a lot of policy interest in the small business jobs. We didn't play around with that very much. We just looked at the sectors and carefully considered what the current composition of those sectors are in relation to small versus large business, and scaled that directly. So what happens is that, citing our report as evidence of good positive outcomes, the UK ICT strategy announced a few months later, cited our work. We were the only academic study cited in this policy document, and indeed the parallel study, which was done by the National Endowment for Science, Technology, and the Arts, NESTA, which is supposed to do these innovation and economy studies, came up with 320 billion, no, it was 5 million new jobs, and they weren't cited, so our more modest. But in the report, what they said that they were going to do to follow this kind of boost is to allocate 150 million pounds of new money to deal with this. So then I didn't know what to do with that number, because I have no idea whether this kind of investment is scalable down to that small amount. Does half the investment really generate half the number of jobs? I didn't know how to model that problem. And what about 5 or 10%? Does it make a difference at all? So I don't know. It's a real problem with this kind of analysis. So we disaggregated the numbers. They come out very nicely, but again, this is based on £5 billion for each of these kind of sectors, and we come out, yeah, as I say, with relatively big numbers, not nearly enough to solve what in 2010 was a very significant and scary unemployment problem in Britain. Britain's not used in recent years to that kind of unemployment, and we didn't think that we wanted to be compared too closely with the Italians and others. So, you know, all right. So we did find, by this kind of analysis, first of all, the domestic capabilities were surprisingly good. We wouldn't have been able to tell that just by generally looking at the employment characteristics of these subsectors. And it gave us a sense of optimism about it, that the potential growth rates by subsectors is also encouraging, and it holds all kinds of policy implications, most of which are relatively straightforward. So the question is, how do you deal with this kind of study and address other kinds of kindred problems? So we did these two studies of modeling the cloud. And here we just took two sectors, aerospace and smartphone services, really. We did some with mobile operators, but didn't extend that too far. And these then made very similar kinds of hypotheses and looked much more carefully then at domestic capabilities and sourcing, and considered the characteristics of these particular firms in terms of the real use of technology that they engaged. So here are some numbers. We get thousands of jobs but really very small, especially direct. All right, so what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that despite the fact that firms are able to redeploy staff, and they do generate new kinds of work, significant investment in these areas. These are based on planned investment at the firm level. That's done on industry surveys and other such sources, some trend analysis in the firms. Especially in aerospace, there are small numbers of leading firms, so you can do pretty detailed, get a detailed understanding of what these companies are likely to do, as well as the firms, the smaller firms that supply them. And we get these very unastounding numbers. Well, how did we do that? Well, I won't go through this in any detail. I've got a minute left or something? No.
Yeah, a couple of minutes.
Okay. Yeah. That's not the point. The point is that we did structure a model of the characteristics of the sector that broke down the cloud usage into very specific functions within the firm. We assessed different kinds of cloud applications, and we came up with these findings that from different countries, if you got a glance at the national comparisons, the domestic capabilities vary dramatically. Everything varies tremendously by sector, and the implications of that are that these general efforts to characterize employment trends in the economy as a whole, not that I doubt that they can be described in broad brush manner, but when you look down at their specifics, the variation is astonishing. So then we took the analysis to the case of Turkey. I have a special interest in Turkey and good access to a lot of industry people in Turkey. It's a smaller economy. It's also rapidly growing. It still is. At that time, it was growing even more rapidly. And so we had this opportunity to consider the way in which these effects might play out under those conditions. And of course, you get much higher growth rates. You also get very much very small numbers of jobs. Sorry, it doesn't come out nicely, but that was, we substituted the automobile industry for the aerospace industry. Turkey does in fact have an aerospace industry, making mostly F-16 parts, but the automobile industry is very, very large and growing fast, and a major location of European car manufacturers, and especially those exporting to fast-growing markets in Africa and the Middle East. So again, we have nice numbers. I think that these are plausible numbers based on real intended investments, but they don't give us the kind of scenario that would make us feel that we've got everything tied up. So again, just to say that we applied the same kind of methodology. I'll just say briefly, a few words about the London study. The interesting thing about this, and I think it's recommend to you to go and look at the 3 studies at once on New York and San Francisco, is that we were able then to identify through, in particular, want ad and job-based data, the specific positions that were being filled. We did not look in this case at displacement, so we don't have an aggregate figure of what these kinds of digital jobs are doing in aggregate, but we are looking at increasing employment. All 3 places, of course, are growing very fast. The study shows not only that the location matters and the municipal policies actually do matter, but it also shows that for London in particular, and to some significant extent New York, the digital economy activities of the post-economic downturn period were not only significant contributors to the growth of the digital city characteristics and business activities, but that they were a very significant element of the whole of the city's recovery. And that the city's recovery is well documented, so we just wanted to explain the extent to which that could be attributed to the jobs that were there. Now here again, we didn't do an analysis which compared and contrasted the displacement effects of these jobs. But what we did do was a lot of economic geography analysis to see to what extent this was a London phenomena as opposed to a national phenomena, and Michael did this also for New York. And a little bit surprisingly, we found that the digital economy effects of these kinds of investments were almost solely concentrated in London, and indeed not even in those suburban areas, which I know from anecdotal evidence are benefiting to some degree, but it turns out not to any significant degree. So you can see then in the report some maps and lists of comparisons, and if you think that, if you know Southeast England, if you think that London's digital economy boost has been supported or affected by what's happened at Oxford, Cambridge, or Brighton, or Croydon, or elsewhere, you're wrong. So the studies then, I think, leave us with a general notion that local and sectoral matters are important, that general infrastructure and education investments are valuable, but targeting them doesn't make a lot of sense. Targeting and specific spending efforts seem to be inefficient, and we definitely need to temper the boosterism that Ellie noted at the outset, and which our numbers show are wildly exaggerating the real effects of specific investments. Thank you.
So last panelist is David Viviano from SAG-AFTRA Labor Union.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm David Viviano, Chief Economist, Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. So those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we are a US-based labor union. We represent performers on a variety of media, film, television, digital media, sound recordings. Our members include the big movie stars down to background actors, stunt performers, day players, local news anchors, things like that. And what our primary function as a labor union is we negotiate with employers for the minimum terms of compensation and working conditions when our members are working in various media. We also negotiate the terms for residuals compensation when our members' work is moved over to a different market and they earn residuals. We negotiate those terms. Another thing I just want to note is that we cover our members wherever they work in the world. So that's somewhat unlike a lot of traditional US labor unions. When our members go outside of the country, they're still covered by the terms of our collective bargaining agreements. So I'm going to talk to you today about the impact that the internet has had on employment and income, specifically in the US media and entertainment business. And then time allows, I will touch on how we see it impacting the larger economy. So I'm going to start by, well, actually, we're going to be taking a look at the impact that the internet has had on the demand for labor, the supply of labor, and then ultimately the net employment and the impact on net employment and income in our sector. We'll start off by looking at the impact on demand for labor. And then really, in order to understand how the internet has impacted demand, we have to first take a look at how it's changing, how media is being consumed. One big change is that the internet has led to growing shelf space for media content. Decades ago, if you were looking for audio-visual content, you really had to go to the movie theater, or you would find it on one of the major broadcast networks. If you wanted to listen to music, you had to buy a CD, you had to listen to it on the radio. There's a lot more shelf space now thanks to the internet. We have what's called over-the-top internet-based video platforms. These are platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime that deliver audiovisual content to viewers without them having to go through their cable box or traditional connection methods. And that just allows for the delivery of a whole lot more content than in the past. We have online radio and music streaming services. And this really leads to the greater opportunity for the exhibition of library content. So all these TV shows from decades ago that maybe some people like, but they weren't in high enough demand to achieve syndication, now you can get them on the internet. Audiences, they can easily access content that appeals specifically to them. You're no longer limited to having to watch the top rated TV shows. If there's something that appeals only to you and 100 other viewers, you can now get it thanks to the internet. We're seeing that both the new and the established media platforms must now aggressively compete to build audiences, because audiences can now go anywhere they want to find their content. There's just a lot of competition for those eyeballs that the companies want to monetize. Another thing that's an important change that the internet has resulted in, it's a lot easier for audiences to access pirated content. I don't know if any of you have ever done it, but there's sites throughout the internet where you can illegally obtain copyrighted content. So what are the net effects of these forces that I just mentioned? It's been fostering a lot of competition for creating quality content, because there's so much out there. If you want to monetize content, you really have to compete, because there's so much quality content out there. There's also a greater amount of niche content. I'd mentioned that there's content that's now available that is tailored specifically for you and maybe 50 other people. And also there's greater aggregate global demand for American content. So it's easier and easier for viewers throughout the world to access American content. And then the last thing I'll note on this slide regarding pirated content, that's a force that is driving down overall prices. So if you think of pirated content as a substitute good, that's one of the forces that is just driving down the prices that companies can charge for selling legitimate content. So how do these changing consumption patterns impact the demand for labor? One thing it does is it's resulting in the increased production of this niche audience content. And what this does is it drives up the number of overall jobs, because there's more content being produced, there's more roles for performers, more jobs. But at the same time, this niche content tends to have a shorter product life cycle. So if you think about the way content was created decades ago, a lot of it would rerun very frequently. There'd be the potential for back-end payout to performer. Now what we're seeing is a lot of niche content that just goes out there, it's on the internet, it's consumed for a week, and then it essentially dies and nobody sees it again in the future. So that's a pretty big change. We're seeing competition for audiences is increasing the demand for high budget content. So to a lot of discerning viewers, they want to see something highly polished, highly professional, and what this does is it bids up performer wages for the really top talent. So if you think about something like Kevin Spacey starring in the Netflix series House of Cards, big payout, wouldn't have been possible without the internet. How is the internet impacting the supply of labor in our sector? One thing it's doing is it's lowering barriers to entry. So it is now a lot easier for both producers and performers to reach audiences. So if you were a producer and you wanted to produce a piece of content and get it to an audience, decades ago you had to be picked up by a major network, you had to have a feature film studio distribute your content. Now you can make a piece of content this morning, put it on YouTube, you can reach an audience really easily. It's also a lot easier for performers to reach audiences. In the past, if you wanted to be a performer and you wanted to be on screen in front of an audience, you had to get on a bus, go to Hollywood, you had to go through auditions, you had to land a role. Now, same thing, YouTube. You can perform in a low-budget production that you produce yourself, that a producer you know produces, and easily get it in front of audiences. So this makes it also easier for aspiring performers to break into the business, which is attracting new entrants. In the past, making it in Hollywood, making it as a professional performer, it was in many ways a long shot, and in some ways it still is. I had mentioned you had to get on the bus, go out to Hollywood, have all these auditions. Now, if you want to be a professional performer who makes money being on screen, it's a lot easier to do that. It's a realistic aspiration for a lot of people now. So this has been bringing more and more people into this line of work. So now we're going to talk about how these forces have had a net effect on employment and income in this sector. In terms of aggregate employment, we have seen that the internet has been a net creator of jobs for performers. I'm going to show you some numbers here. This is the number of jobs going back to 2001 in what our contracts cover as far as entertainment work. And the blue bars are showing the number of jobs in film and television. Red is showing this is content made for new media. And what we have seen is clearly there are more jobs now as a result of content being produced for the internet. But at the same time, while this is positive, the impact is still relatively minimal. Most of the entertainment jobs that our members are finding are in the traditional film and television space. That's not to say that traditional film and television is not being moved over to the internet, and that's something I'll touch on in subsequent slides, but as far as new jobs that are newly created, it's been a minimal impact from digital media.
What are those horizontal scale? What is that?
Yeah, that's, thank you for calling me out on that. That's actually confidential information. A lot of what you've noticed that there's very limited actual numbers that I'm showing here. Our internal data is considered extremely sensitive, confidential, because we use a lot of this material in bargaining with the major studios, and when this information gets out, it can come back to bite us. So I apologize for the opaqueness with the numbers, and I appreciate any of you who are trusting me. But as far as what the number of jobs is, that is the number of engagements on a freelance basis of people working under our contracts. Not necessarily our members, but people working under our contracts. So this can include... It's in the tens of thousands. So I apologize again for the opaqueness. But what I will say is that as far as the number of jobs are something that's very different. So if you're a day player and you show up for 1 day of work, that's a job. If you're a series regular and you are starring in 23 episodes within one season of a TV show, that's a job. So within our sector, it's not necessarily an ideal way to gauge overall employment, but it is one of the pieces of data that I can comfortably show here, even in this limited extent. So what have these forces done with performer income? There's been both upward pressure and downward pressure. The upward pressure has been there's increased distribution of library content. This is old content that's now available somewhere on Netflix or some other platform that's being monetized. This drives up aggregate residuals earnings because when content is moved over to another digital platform like this, the content owners pay residuals to the performers. So on an overall basis, that's driving up aggregate residuals. We're also seeing that there's increased competition for top talent, and this bids up the compensation for the star performers, the big name talent that a lot of you are probably very familiar with. But at the same time, there is quite a bit of downward pressure. I had mentioned there's a lot of new entrants to the business. So we're seeing increased competition for jobs, and this is exerting downward pressure on earnings for the non-star performers. So in the past, if you were a certain type of performer, let's say you played, you were going out to audition for the role of middle-aged moms. And there were maybe 10, 15 other talented performers who you'd have to compete against. Now there's hundreds of other people who can do that role who you have to compete with. We're also seeing a shorter shelf life of content, and this means less average residuals per job. It may not seem like a big deal, but when you're talking about a profession where employment is very irregular, you have to audition every month, you're not sure how much you're going to be making 2 months from now. Residuals is important because it smooths out the earnings of a performer. So ultimately, we're seeing further migration towards a winner-take-all labor market. The show business in the U.S. has been for decades and decades very much a winner-take-all labor market. But what we've seen as a result of the internet is it's becoming even more so. So for our members, this has upsides and downsides. There has been increases in the net number of jobs and aggregate employment. Our members love it when they have an opportunity for a job that they wouldn't have ordinarily had. There's also higher compensation for some of the star talent. Our movie star members love it when their compensation gets bid up. There have also been downsides. There's greater income variability for individual performers on a year-to-year basis. So if you had a great year this year and you made $100,000 doing acting work, you have no idea that you're going to make anything next year. So it's that uncertainty is definitely a factor that weighs on our members. It's also harder for some performers to maintain a career in the business because there's a lot of jobs out there, but they aren't all well-paying jobs, and they can't count on residuals. So it's harder to sustain a career over years than it was in the past. So what's the role of our organization? When it comes to the kind of issues that I talked about, there's 2 big roles. One, we collectively bargain wage floors for initial compensation. So when our members do get a job, we make sure that they're earning fair pay for that work. And we also ensure that emerging distribution platforms pay fair residuals so that when our members' work is exploited for incremental money, that they're able to share in some of that gain. And now just briefly talk about organized labor and how do we view the impact of the internet on other sectors of the economy. And really, there's no coherent view on the part of domestic organized labor. And that, in my opinion, is really because if you look at how labor unions in the United States and in other countries are set up, they're really segmented by various sectors. And so, as a lot of you know, some sectors have really benefited from the internet, some have not. And so different labor unions have very different opinions on the matter. And what organized labor in the United States has not done is figure out, how do we take a stance on this? There's shifting jobs, there's career transitions, but when you have isolated labor unions, it's very hard to come up with a coherent view. So just thinking of some examples, if you're the Teamsters and you represent truck drivers who are delivering packages from Amazon.com, you're seeing a huge amount of growth of work. If you are a labor union representing newspaper workers and all these newspapers are going out of business, you're going to have a very different opinion. So there's a lot that organized labor does not agree on, and this is something that we have yet to come up with a coherent policy statement on. And with that, I will close.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. So now it is 5-6 minutes for question and comments. Yeah, maybe we can come. Yeah.
Is it possible you could use the mic for questions?
Yes. Okay, this is for you. Okay, so there with that.
Is there a hand mic anywhere?
Yeah.
I'll be happy to walk it around. Tell you what, let's borrow one of these. Panelists can share this.
Should be up. Make things easier for you.
Okay.
This one here.
All right. Thank you. My name's Richard Field. Thank you, panelists. It was very interesting. I wanted to know, though, maybe specifically for Vincenzo, but maybe for the others too, talking about the effect of ICT on employment seems to me like saying, what's the effect of eating on health? Well, you want to eat something, and you don't want to eat too much. But you really have to get into the weeds. You have to get into the details. And with ICT, there's ICT that leads to increased productivity. You give somebody a typewriter, maybe they're more productive, but they're still there. There's ICT that replaces you. For a company to earn $1 billion this year, you need fewer people. And maybe in the future, you only need one person, and they can make the $1 billion, whereas in the past, you needed 1,000 people to make $1 billion. That's critical. It leads to the wage variation, and it leads to other things. There's also ICT that globalizes things. It's like taking a balloon that's full and a balloon that's empty. Once you connect them, the full one's going to empty out. They're going to even out. And once you connect two countries, the labor force, you're going to see wage decrease in one and wage increase in another. Possibly in the future, the one that has increased wages will then suffer from the second one, which is all their increased wages will now disappear because it's now they're being replaced. So they may have substantial issues. Okay. The question is, how can you study ICT as an effect of employment without getting into those kinds of details?
Anyone have an answer?
Do we?
Do you want to speak first?
Yes,
Head of the mic?
I have one. They clue it to me. I mean, I think it depends on the level of abstraction that you use. Again, there is you can have a very focused lens and see at the details of what happens in firms, industry specific. And of course, your considerations are perfectly to the point. But when you want to see what are the effects on employment, you need to move up and to move to something which is the markets or the industries and so on. So you need to make that step. So I agree that when you measure things like investment, when you measure things like input cost, you're going to make a big abstraction in terms of you bundle in investments, equipments, goods that are different by nature and so on. And you can, there's just one bit of the variation that you can capture. I think that's basically the only way you can put yourself into trade-off between details without any possibility to analyze what happens in the market, and then a view that looks at the market and interactions between different forces and different actors. So that's the. But there is nothing. One thing that I don't know whether. I mean, there is nothing specific to ICT in the sense of saying when you talk about investment goods, you're talking about things that are very different. And even if you make the breakdown software and equipment and telecommunication, hardware and so on, even if you still talking about things that are very different. But this is for ICT, is also for other type of investment. So it's an issue that is with us as soon as you start to talk about economics and growth and inputs, you end up with the issue of, okay, how good is the aggregation that you do of different inputs? So that's, I think it's nothing ICT specific. It's, we have probably less experience with ICT than with other capital goods that are more established, we've been using for a while. So.
Yeah, I wanted just to add.
So one of the things that all of you included in your models were basically labor, demand, and supply, but I think there is a demographic element here that was missing. I wanted to get your take about it because we know that the baby boomers are retiring now. At the same time, we have a lower levels of births in general, and we're seeing, in fact, some declines in cities. So even though we're listening from you all of these relatively doomed scenarios, at the same time, we have a situation where we have an actual population decline in many of the countries that are more experienced in this technological advancement. So my question is, how do you see that playing into, the kind of models that you guys have, trying to use to explain this problem?
You want to add something to the previous question?
Yeah,
no?
Okay, so no, for the previous question, I will just say that for me, what you are saying is very interesting, especially when considering the winners take all issue. No? Like one guy now can have a company of $1 billion and very easily and so on. This is very difficult to investigate. For scholars, I think that it's quite not easy, but we can investigate the loser. No? In my paper, I try to investigate that. It's really easy. Well, it's not easy to investigate the winners take all because everybody can see that it's something that is taking place, but we don't have data. We don't actually investigate the impact of ICT and technology on them. You know, we can just see that top incomes are increasing a lot. This is true in all countries, the Piketty story and so on, but which is the impact of technologies or something else? So this is very interesting, and to me now there is very little on the floor. No? There is no research on that. And just a brief comments on what you're saying. It's very interesting, and I think that now, for the moment, the population is not getting down in most of the country because of immigration. So like immigration is replacing, in a sense, the decrease in birth rate. And so this might affect our analysis because usually immigrants, there is the literature by the immigration that is show that immigrants are more employed in unskilled jobs, and so it might even reinforce like the polarization stuff because immigrants and natives are, by definition are different. For instance, in the face-to-face interactions in jobs that are more service-oriented. So this can be, it's already an issue investigated in the literature, and it's very interesting.
Next question here.
This question is for Vincenzo and one for David. And first, I want to thank you, Lorenzo, for putting together such an excellent and interesting panel, and a panel from different continents, all of whose surnames end in a vowel. For Vincenzo, I wanted to ask you, I've been working on a project for the last few years, which is a debt forgiveness from Spain to Nicaragua. Spain is forgiving a debt of Nicaragua, which created, it's an infrastructure project which created jobs, and they did the debt forgiveness to create the jobs. Do you see this as a growing trend? Is this insignificant in the scheme of things? Or, but for all the time I've worked with World Bank, I frankly haven't seen any debt forgivenesses. This is the first one I've seen. Is this a new phenomenon, and do you see this as maybe growing as countries want to replace perhaps the unlikelihood of collecting a stale and old debt from another country with jobs from their own country? And then the question for David is about the House of Cards phenomenon that you mentioned. A Netflix type of episode will be episodic for actors. They won't have the residuals that they have in a standard program. Of course, that's not the case with House of Cards. Netflix invested huge amounts of dollars in a superstar, and that has paid off in presenting basically a mainstream series. Does your thought that Netflix will not do this repeatedly mean that House of Cards is an anomaly for a Netflix type of presentation and creation of jobs? Thank you.
Short answer, then we have to close. Yeah. Please.
Actually, we're not seeing this as an anomaly. We're seeing continued growth of high-budget, made-for-internet series, and it's really competing with the traditional series such as HBO, the major broadcast networks. At the same time, we're still seeing a proliferation of very low-budget content, the YouTube kind of thing as well.
Can we take it later out after? Yes, because we're running. Okay.
Okay, we are running late, so I think we should thank all the speakers with a nice round of applause, and we will now we have a coffee break. We resume in about 11:25.